In most of our current societies and cultures, there is a more or less clear separation of classes, depending on your upbringing, your place of birth, your education, your workplace, your political power, and most importantly, your wealth. Despite huge wealth disparities and inequalities, class struggle has often been reserved for moments of crisis in history. This begs the question, in what way the upper classes of the world maintained their hegemony and how you can create your own special little hegemony over the cultures and societies of your own world you are building. I won't talk about the actual theory for too long because I don't want to lose many viewers, but the theory claims that the ideas of the ruling class come to be seen as the norm by the lower classes. In the cultural hegemony, these ideologies are seen as universal and seem to benefit everyone, whilst only really benefiting the ruling class themselves. And now some examples. During history class back in school, you've probably learned about the medieval class system, where the common people are at the bottom of the pyramid, ruled by the nobles and the church as the representation of God's power on earth. Naturally, medieval class dynamics were more complicated than what is taught by a simple graph in school, but the idea of the class pyramid isn't just something invented out of thin air by historiographers 100 years ago to simplify medieval society. The medieval class trinity is an idea developed by contemporary church philosophers and theologians during the end of late antiquity and the beginning of the early medieval age. The church in European feudalism was both part of the power structure and, more importantly, it was a cultural institution. Church gatherings and festivals, and of course the Holy Mass, were part of medieval daily life just as much as you watching videos on YouTube. Their control over those gatherings and thus over society gave the church a lot of power over society. Power the church maintains to this day, even though not as strong as back in the day, of course. The power the church maintained is referred to as the cultural hegemony. The church, and to the same extent the nobility, sold their idea of an ideal society to the common folk. The common folk, on the other hand, adopted this thought despite their actual interests and daily needs being different. The church made the people believe that the Pope is God's representation on earth, the king is the sword of God and the rightful ruler of a certain bit of land. The nobles are likewise the rightful representatives of the kings, and if you don't agree, you go to hell. Pro tip: making people feel conscious about their afterlife is an especially helpful tool to maintain a hegemony over the culture and society. But religion isn't the only way to make people believe into the same set of goals as your ruling classes to maintain control. Nationalism, especially in the modern world, is just as effective. But instead of relying on modern examples you were taught in school, let's see how the Romans did it, as an old imperial example is more suitable for fantasy world building. The Roman Empire spread along the entire Mediterranean Sea and beyond. A massive empire for its time. Nothing in Europe, Northern Africa and Western Asia would come close to for centuries after. A massive empire meant a hot pot of countless of cultures they either conquered or incorporated through diplomatic means. And with their armies and diplomats, they spread their culture. People within the empire became more Roman. Especially the ruling classes adopted the Roman way of life. They adapted Latin, which later evolved into the many Romance languages of Europe. In the East they did the same, but with Greek, because Greek was already established in the East, so it was just easier than to teach them Latin, especially since they saw the Greek as civilized people anyways. This didn't go perfectly well, of course. There were many that resisted, most famously the Germanics of the Cheruscians that followed Arminius and won against the Romans within the Teutoburg forest. But those were basically footnotes in comparison to the Roman success for so many centuries. At the same time, the Romans had to control their own population in a way. The Romans of the city of Rome and later the entire Italian peninsula. The free citizens which were split between the plebeians and the patricians. Even though the social structure of Rome is complicated and not part of the scope of this video, let's just take the plebeians as the lower class for the sake of explanation. There were a couple of ways how the patricians kept the plebeian interests in line, partially by tying the success of individual patricians to the success of the plebeians they have under their wings under the patronage system of Rome, which is such an interesting and unique system that it deserves its own video. Something even more effective than that was the Roman triumph, which made all of Rome get into an uproar. A relative rare occasion in the early republic, the triumph became more and more common over the years. The triumph was a grand spectacle for everyone in Rome. And as a patrician, it was important to patronize and showcase their wealth by giving it to the poor through gifts, or more commonly known through bread and games. Entertainment was a huge deal for Rome. No matter if hosting theater events or, of course, gladiatorial combat, the people loved to forget their daily struggles if they get to sit in the Colosseum for one day. In general, cultural hegemony was maintained through several effective means: religion, pride, nationalism, bread and games, entertainment, or literally binding the success of the individual upper class person to yours. The interests of the lower class, this alignment of interest between different classes of society, is an important tool to maintain control and somewhat of a structure within a hierarchy that mostly benefits the upper classes. And in fantasy, the diversification of class systems can add another layer to it, of course. Magic and a magical world even more so. For example, there might be a belief that the upper class are the only ones able to protect the lower classes from the monstrous wilds, because only they know how to cast the spells necessary. Thus they are the only ones to learn magic, study magic, practice magic, which in turn gives themselves again power to maintain the class structures. Another example could be more religious in nature, where certain gods and magical creatures, angelic-like creatures, which could be anything, delegate power to the clergy, who in turn have actual word of God on their side. The cultural hegemony can have massive grips on society, especially if the stuff they claim are more or less real. But it really doesn't have to be real. And that's it for today's video, world builders. Tell me the ways your people are kept in line and how culture and cultural thought is controlled by the ruling classes in your world in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe. See ya.